Welcome back. I've got a special story to share today.
Silas Vance laughed as he dumped the dregs of his heavy red wine onto Elena Vance's cream-colored dress in front of the entire heritage board. The crimson liquid bloomed across the silk like a fresh wound, stark and mocking. The chatter in the grand dining room of the Vance manor died instantly, replaced by the sharp, rhythmic ticking of the mahogany grandfather clock in the foyer. "Oh, dear," Silas said, his voice dripping with a feigned, oily regret. He didn't look at her face. He looked at the stain, his lips curling into the practiced sneer of a man who had spent decades judging others from a bench. "I suppose I forgot that someone of your industrial background might not be accustomed to fine Bordeaux. It's a bit more refined than the tap water you likely drink at the quarry." Elena didn't gasp. She didn't jump up to scrub at the fabric. She sat perfectly still, her spine a straight line of tempered steel. Beneath the table, her fingers brushed against her own palms. They were rough, mapped with the fine white scars of a master stonemason, a stark contrast to the smooth, pampered hands of the men surrounding her. The scent of the expensive, oak-aged wine hit her, sharp, fermented, and sour, clashing with the delicate perfume of the white lilies arranged in the center of the table. "It's quite all right, Silas," she said, her voice low and steady. It was the tone she used when measuring a slab of granite, precise and unyielding. "Accidents happen when one's grip begins to fail." A few of the board members shifted in their seats, their eyes darting between the disgraced former judge and the niece he had spent years trying to erase. Julian Vance, sitting to her left, stared intently at his plate. He reached for his water glass, his hand trembling just enough to make the ice clink against the crystal. He owed his father everything, his job, his car, his mounting gambling debts, and Elena could see the weight of that golden leash pulling at his shoulders. Silas leaned back, adjusting his silk tie. "My grip is just fine, Elena. It's your presence here that's slippery. This is a meeting for those who build legacies, not those who merely chip away at the dirt. You smell of wet grout and poverty. It's distracting the committee from the business at hand." "The business of the Vance estate?" Elena asked. She finally looked up, her green eyes locking onto his. "Or the business of selling off the pieces you haven't managed to break yet?" Martha Vance, Silas's wife, let out a soft, sharp breath. She sat at the far end of the table, a ghost in diamonds, her face a mask of practiced neutrality that masked years of emotional suppression. She looked at Elena for a fleeting second, a spark of something, pity or perhaps a long-buried envy, flickering in her gaze before she returned to her salad. "You're overstepping," Silas snapped, the veneer of the jovial host cracking. He slammed his hand onto the table, making the silver spoons jump against the porcelain. "You were invited tonight out of a sense of familial obligation, a charity case to remind the board that the Vance name still looks after its less fortunate branches, but even charity has its limits." He turned to the board members, his smile returning like a predator-s. "My niece has spent too much time among the laborers. She's forgotten that in this house, we value structure. We value the heights of the spire, not the mud of the foundation." Elena felt the weight of the heavy iron key in her hidden pocket. It was cold against her thigh, a secret gift from Arthur Penhaligon, the old family solicitor who had been the only one to visit her at the work site. Arthur had told her things about the manor's true deed, things that Silas, in his arrogant haste to consolidate power, had overlooked. "The spire doesn't stay up without the foundation, Silas," she said quietly. She stood up, the wine-stained silk clinging to her legs. She didn't look humiliated. She looked like a queen surveying a crumbling ruin. "And if the foundation is cracked, the whole thing comes down, no matter how much gold leaf you slap on the ceiling." Silas gave a short, barking laugh. "Is that a threat? From a girl who spends her days hitting rocks with a hammer? Security will show you out. I believe you have a bus to catch." He didn't notice the way the board's chairman, a man who valued stability above all else, narrowed his eyes at Silas's outburst. The judge was losing his cool, and in this circle, losing your cool was the same as losing your blood. Elena didn't wait for security. She turned and walked toward the foyer, her heels clicking a steady, deliberate rhythm on the marble floor. The sound echoed through the silent dining room, a countdown Silas was too arrogant to hear. In the shadows of the hallway, Arthur Penhaligon was waiting. He leaned against the stone archway, his eyes gleaming with a quiet, dangerous satisfaction. He handed her a dark wool coat to cover the stain. "He took the bait," Arthur whispered. Elena slipped the coat on, feeling the weight of the evidence folder tucked into the lining. She looked back at the dining room, where Silas was already bragging about his next development project, unaware that the very chair he sat on was resting on a legal sinkhole. "He thinks he's the architect," Elena said, her voice cold as a winter frost. "He hasn't realized I'm the one who knows where the load-bearing walls are." She stepped out into the cool night air, the heavy oak doors thudding shut behind her. She had exactly 3 days until the heritage filing was made public. 3 days to let Silas believe he had won. She touched the rough stone of the manor's exterior as she descended the steps. She could feel the vibration of the house, the secrets hidden in the mortar. Silas Vance had spent a lifetime judging others, but he had never learned how to read the stone. 3 days, Silas," she murmured into the dark. "Enjoy the view from the top, while you still have a floor." The next morning, the scent of damp earth and pulverized limestone filled the workshop. Elena Vance stood at her workbench, the rhythmic scrape of a steel rasp against a slab of gray slate providing the only soundtrack to her thoughts. Her hands were steady, though her mind was a tempest of legal clauses and heritage maps. The workshop was her sanctuary, a place of dust and heavy lifting where she had spent years refining the craft Silas had always looked down upon. The peace didn't last. The roar of a high-performance engine shattered the morning quiet, followed by the crunch of gravel under heavy tires. Through the open bay door, a black Range Rover glinted in the sunlight, a predatory shadow against the rustic landscape. Silas Vance stepped out, his polished Italian leather loafers looking absurd against the dirt floor. He adjusted his silk tie, his gaze sweeping over the racks of tools and half-finished monuments with visible distaste. "I had hoped a night of reflection would bring you to your senses," he said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man who had spent decades behind a judicial bench. She didn't look up. "The stone takes time, Silas. So do I." He walked further into her space, his presence an invasive species. "Time is a luxury you no longer possess. I've already authorized the survey teams for the North Ridge. Your little hobby shop is sitting directly on the path for the new clubhouse." He pulled a thick envelope from his breast pocket and tossed it onto the dusty workbench, sending a cloud of white powder into the air. "That's a relocation fee. It's more than this entire plot is worth. Sign the release by noon tomorrow, or I'll have the sheriff serve the eviction notice personally." "You're evicting me from my own home." She finally met his eyes. Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears, but her expression remained carved from the same granite she worked. "It belongs to the estate," he snapped, his face reddening. "And as the head of that estate, I decide its use. You're a stonemason, Elena. You deal in rubble, I deal in legacies. Don't force me to remind you how little you actually matter in the grand design." He turned on his heel, the smell of his expensive, cloying cologne lingering in the air long after the SUV had sped away. She watched the dust settle, her fingers brushing the rough texture of the slate. He truly believed the lies he'd told himself for 40 years. He thought money could move mountains, but he didn't realize she was the one who knew how to find the fault lines. An hour later, the bell above the door chimed, a lighter, more melodic sound. Arthur Penhaligon stepped inside, his tweed coat smelling of old paper and peppermint. He didn't look at the envelope Silas had left. Instead, he reached into his worn leather satchel and pulled out a heavy, brass-bound ledger. "He was here," Arthur said. It wasn't a question. "He's moving the survey teams," she replied, her voice low. "He thinks he can bulldoze the North Ridge before the heritage filing hits the desk." The older man placed the ledger on the table. "He's forgotten one thing. The ridge wasn't part of the original land grant. It was Beatrice's dowry, held in a separate trust that he never had the legal authority to touch. He opened the book to a page yellowed by a century of shadows. Look at the signatures on the 1998 transfer. She leaned in, her breath catching. The ink was dark, the loops of the letters sharp. Below her grandmother's shaky hand was a witness signature that made her blood turn to ice. It wasn't a lawyer or a notary. It was Julian Vance, his name written in the sprawling, immature script of a teenager. He used his own son to forge the secondary witness line, she whispered. He's been building his kingdom on a foundation of sand and stolen ink, Arthur said. The Heritage Gala is in 48 hours. He's planning to announce the groundbreaking then. He'll have the governor there, the press, the entire board. She closed the ledger, the heavy thud echoing through the rafters. Then let him invite the world. It'll make the collapse that much louder. She walked to the back of the workshop, where a heavy tarp covered a massive project. She pulled it back, revealing a meticulously restored boundary marker, the original stone that defined the estate's true borders. It was etched with the Penhaligon crest, not the Vance name. 2 days, she murmured, her hand resting on the cool, ancient stone. He wants to show everyone his legacy. I think it's time he learned what a real foundation looks like. As the sun began to dip, her phone buzzed with a message from Martha Vance. He's drinking again, talking about cleaning house. Be careful, Elena. He knows you have the folder. She didn't reply. She looked at the stone, then at the clock. The countdown wasn't just for the gala anymore. It was for the moment the man who dismissed her as a mere laborer realized that she held the hammer that would shatter his world. He had spent a lifetime judging others from a high seat, never imagining that the roots of his own house were being eaten away from below. She picked up her chisel one last time, the cold steel a promise in her hand. The ridge would not fall, but Silas would. 2 days later, the air in Arthur Penhaligon's private study was thick with the scent of beeswax and the dry, vanilla-like aroma of ancient paper. Elena Vance sat across from the man who had served as her grandmother's silent guardian for decades. On the mahogany desk between them lay a heavy, iron-bound ledger and a series of yellowed maps that predated the modern county lines. The light from a single desk lamp pooled over the documents, casting long, sharp shadows across the room. He didn't just move the boundaries, Elena, Arthur said, his voice a low, steady rasp. He pointed a weathered finger at a specific embossed seal on the bottom of a 1954 land grant. Silas Vance systematically erased the Penhaligon name from the public record. This deed shows the ridge, the very foundation of the estate, was never legally his. He forged the transfer documents after your grandmother's accident, while your father was still too young to understand the value of the dirt beneath his feet. She felt a cold, sharp thrill run through her. She reached out, her fingertips grazing the rough, deckled edge of the parchment. This was the hammer she had been searching for. For years, she had been treated as a charity case in her own ancestral home, a girl allowed to play with rocks while the real Vances handled the legacy. Now she held the proof that the entire Vance empire was a lie built on a foundation of theft. "Is it enough to hold up?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur nodded, his eyes bright with a shared, simmering fire. "It's enough to strip him of everything. The house, the accounts, the very ground he walks on. He's been living in a stolen castle, and you're the rightful heir to the foundation. I've already had my colleagues in the city verify the signatures. They're a match for the forgery seals used in the '62 probate hearing." She tucked the digital copies into an encrypted folder on her phone, the haptic vibration of the device feeling like a heartbeat against her palm. The physical documents would remain in Arthur's safe until the moment of impact. She didn't want Silas to have even a second of warning. Later that evening, the grand hallway of the Vance Manor felt smaller than usual, the shadows stretching like grasping fingers across the marble. Elena was heading toward the stairs when the heavy oak door of the library swung open. Silas stepped out, the smell of expensive, peaty scotch preceding him like a warning. His tie was loosened, his face flushed with the kind of bloated confidence that only came from a bottle and a lifetime of getting his way. "There she is," he sneered, leaning against the doorframe. The little Mason, still covered in dust, I see. It's pathetic, really. You spend your days chipping away at rocks while I'm out there securing the future of this family. Elena stopped, her hand tightening on the strap of her bag. She could feel the weight of the phone inside, the digital evidence a hidden weapon. The future is a fickle thing, Silas. Sometimes it doesn't look anything like the past. He laughed, a harsh, grating sound that echoed off the high ceilings. Don't get philosophical with me. I've just finished the guest list for the gala. Every major donor, every judge in the state will be here to see the unveiling of the new wing. And you. You'll be in the back, in your work clothes, making sure the catering staff doesn't steal the silver. Try not to embarrass us with that commoner's grit under your nails. Silas took a step closer, invading her personal space. He smelled of old oak and arrogance. Julian is in over his head again, gambling debts in the city. I've decided that your little inheritance from Beatrice, the small trust I've been managing, will go towards settling his accounts. Consider it your contribution to the family name. It's the only useful thing you've ever provided. The rage spiked in Elena's chest, hot and suffocating. He wasn't just stealing her past. He was still actively looting her present, treating her father's legacy like a slush fund for Julian Vance's mistakes. He looked at her as if she were a piece of equipment, a tool to be used and discarded at his whim. That trust was for my father's medical bills, she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, icy level. Your father was a dreamer and a failure, Silas snapped, his face reddening as he pointed a trembling finger at her. He died with nothing, and if you keep that defiant look on your face, you'll follow him into the dirt. Now get out of my sight. I have a legacy to celebrate, and I don't want the smell of the quarry lingering in my hall. Elena didn't flinch. She watched him stumble back into the library, the heavy crystal tumbler in his hand clinking against his gold signet ring with a rhythmic, mocking sound. From inside the room, she could hear Julian's voice, low and pleading, followed by the muffled, rhythmic sound of Martha Vance sobbing. The house was a cage, and Silas was a drunken jailer who didn't realize the locks had already been changed. She climbed the stairs, her pulse steady despite the fury vibrating in her limbs. She thought of the ridgestone, the Penhaligon crest hidden beneath the Vance facade. Silas thought he was at the summit of his power, preparing for a coronation that would cement his name in history. He had no idea that the ground beneath his feet was already beginning to shift. In the sanctuary of her room, she pulled out a single, polished stone she had kept from the ridge. It was smooth, cold, and unyielding. She looked at the clock on her nightstand. 24 hours until the gala. 24 hours until the man who called her a failure learned that he was nothing more than a squatter in a house built on lies. She picked up her phone and sent a one-word message to Arthur. Ready. The countdown had reached its final cycle. Tomorrow, the world would see the Vance family for what they truly were. And Silas would finally understand that while he was busy looking at the stars from his stolen balcony, Elena had been pulling the earth out from under his feet. He had spent a lifetime judging others from a high seat, never imagining that the girl in the dust was the one holding the keys to his prison. The morning of the gala arrived with a suffocating stillness that tasted of expensive wood polish and old secrets. Elena Vance stood on the second-floor landing, her hand resting lightly on the mahogany railing that Silas Vance claimed was carved from a single ancient tree. It was a lie, of course. Arthur had shown her the receipts from a mass-production lumber yard years ago, but Silas loved the theater of his own importance. Down in the grand foyer, Silas was barking orders at a team of florists. He looked up, his eyes narrowing as they landed on Elena. He didn't see a niece or a survivor. He saw a blemish on his curated perfection. "Why are you still hovering?" Silas called out, his voice echoing off the marble. "The caterers will be here in an hour. If you can't make yourself useful, at least make yourself invisible. I won't have you dragging your dusty boots across the floors today." Elena didn't flinch. Instead, she descended the stairs with a slow, deliberate grace that made Julian Vance pause in the doorway of the dining room. He was holding a stack of seating charts, his face pale and drawn, but his gaze remained fixed on Elena. He noticed the way she held her chin, not in defiance but in possession. "The dust washes off, Silas," Elena said, her voice cool and level as she reached the bottom step. "But some things stay under the skin. You should be careful. The air is thin at the top of the mountain." Silas let out a sharp, jagged laugh that smelled of early morning scotch and arrogance. He stepped closer, invading her space, his shadow looming over her. "Is that a threat, Elena? From a girl who spent her life chipping at rocks? You've been here a week and you think you understand the weight of this house. You are a guest by my mercy alone. Don't forget that when the guests arrive tonight." He reached out, flicking a stray thread from her shoulder with a gesture of profound dismissal. "Tonight is about legacy." "My legacy? You're just the background noise." Elena felt the smooth, cold weight of the ridgestone in her pocket. It was a tactile anchor, a reminder of the earth that didn't lie. She looked past him to the portrait of her grandmother Beatrice hanging in the hall. The old woman's eyes seemed to follow her, glinting with a secret they both now shared. "I'm looking forward to the toast," Elena replied, her smile small and sharp. "I think everyone will find it illuminating." Silas snorted, turning back to the florists without another word. His dismissal was absolute, born of a lifetime of never being challenged. He was so blinded by the glare of his own reflection that he couldn't see the cracks spiderwebbing through the foundation of his world. Julian stepped forward as Silas marched away. He caught Elena's arm, his grip trembling. "Elena, don't. He's in a state. Just stay out of his way tonight, please, for Martha's sake." "Martha Vance is stronger than you think, Julian," she said, gently disengaging her arm. "And Silas is weaker than he knows." She left him standing in the foyer, the scent of lilies and floor wax-thick in the air. Upstairs, in the quiet of the guest wing, Arthur Penhaligon was waiting. He was sitting by the window, a leather-bound ledger open on his knees. When Elena entered, he didn't need to ask if she was ready. He could see it in the set of her shoulders. "The final documents are notarized," Arthur whispered, his voice steady. "The board members have all confirmed their attendance. Silas thinks they're coming to celebrate his expansion. They're actually coming to witness his audit." Elena walked to the window, looking out over the sprawling Vance estate. In a few hours, the drive would be choked with luxury cars. The elite of the city would gather under these chandeliers, sipping champagne and nodding at Silas's lies. They would see the sleeping lion wake up, but it wouldn't be the man at the head of the table. 8 hours, Elena murmured, watching the sun climb higher. 8 hours until the house of cards falls. She felt a strange sense of peace. The rage that had fueled her for years had cooled into something harder, something like the granite she had spent her life shaping. It was no longer about anger. It was about gravity. Silas had spent his life building a throne on a cliffside, and Elena was simply the one showing him that the edge had already crumbled. She touched the stone in her pocket one last time before heading to the wardrobe where her dress for the evening hung, a deep, obsidian silk that looked like the night sky before a storm. The countdown had moved past the stage of planning. Now, there was only the wait. By midnight, the name Vance would mean something entirely different to the world, and Silas would finally learn that the girl he tried to bury was the only one who knew where the bodies were hidden. The evening arrived with a chilling precision that mirrored the sharp lines of the Vance estate. By 7 o'clock, the grand ballroom was a sea of shimmering silk and stiff tuxedos, the air thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of chilled champagne. Elena stood at the edge of the terrace, her fingers tracing the smooth, cold surface of the obsidian silk she wore. It felt like armor. She watched Silas through the floor-to-ceiling glass. He was in his element, the center of a gravitating circle of judges, politicians, and developers. He moved with the practiced ease of a man who believed the ground beneath his feet was eternal. Every time he threw his head back to laugh, the light caught the heavy gold ring on his finger, a ring that had belonged to Elena's father before Silas had systematically erased him from the family records. "You're hovering, Elena," a voice clipped at her shoulder. She didn't turn. She knew the cadence of Julian's anxiety. He sounded like a man who had spent the last hour drowning his mounting debts in top-shelf scotch. When she finally looked at him, he was pale, his eyes darting toward the security detail near the entrance. "I'm observing," she replied, her voice as steady as the stone she carved. "It's a beautiful wake, don't you think?" Julian flinched, his glass rattling against his wedding band. "Don't talk like that. Tonight is about the foundation. Silas is announcing the expansion. If this goes well, we're all set for life." "If," she echoed, her gaze drifting back to their uncle. Silas noticed them then. He broke away from a group of city council members and marched toward them, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. He looked Elena up and down with a condescending tilt of his head that made her blood simmer. "Elena," he said, his voice carrying just enough to ensure the nearby guests could hear. "I must say, I'm impressed. The dress almost makes one forget you spend your days covered in grit and dust, though I'd suggest you keep your hands behind your back. I'd hate for the governor to see the calluses of a common laborer." A few of the surrounding sycophants let out a tittering laugh. Silas beamed, preening in the glow of his own cruelty. He reached out, patting her cheek with a patronizing flick of his fingers. "Try to stay in the shadows, dear. We wouldn't want the help getting confused about which side of the tray they belong on." Elena didn't flinch. She didn't look away. Instead, she felt the small, hard weight of the digital drive tucked into the hidden pocket of her dress. It was a tiny thing, no larger than a thumb, but it contained the digitized ledger of every bribe Silas had ever taken, every document he'd forged to strip her mother of her inheritance. "I know exactly where I belong, Silas," she said softly. "I wonder if you can say the same." His smile faltered for a fraction of a second, a shadow of genuine malice flickering in his eyes before he smoothed it over. "Empty words from an empty girl. Julian, come. We have guests to influence." He swept away, dragging Julian into his wake like a master pulling a leash. Elena watched them go, her heart hammering a slow, deliberate rhythm against her ribs. She felt a presence beside her, the familiar, grounding scent of old paper and cedarwood. Arthur Penhaligon didn't look at her. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the same scene. "The board members are all in the first 3 rows," he murmured. "The media is set up at the back. Everything is in position, Elena. There is no turning back once he takes that podium." "I've been turning back for 10 years, Arthur," she whispered. "Tonight, I only move forward." She scanned the room, finding Martha Vance seated near the front. Her mother looked fragile, a ghost in a gown of pale lavender, her eyes fixed on the floor as if trying to disappear into the patterned rug. Silas had spent decades convincing Martha she was lucky he'd taken them in, lucky he hadn't left them to rot after her husband's disgrace. The gaslighting had been a slow poison, but Elena was the antidote. The sound of a silver spoon tapping against a crystal flute cut through the chatter. The room began to settle, a hush falling over the crowd as Silas climbed the 3 steps to the mahogany podium. He looked magnificent in the spotlight, the image of a patriarch, a pillar of the community, a man of unimpeachable character. "Friends, colleagues, honored guests," Silas began, his voice booming with a practiced warmth. "Tonight, we celebrate more than just a foundation. We celebrate a legacy. The Vance name has stood for integrity and strength in this city for 3 generations." Elena moved through the crowd. She didn't rush. She drifted like a shadow along the perimeter, moving toward the technical booth where the large presentation screens were currently displaying a looping slideshow of the Vance family's charitable works. "My late brother would be proud to see where we are today," Silas continued, his voice dropping into a faux somber tone. "He was a man of vision, though perhaps too trusting. I have spent my life ensuring that his mistakes did not tarnish the name we all carry." Elena reached the booth. The young technician looked up, startled, but she offered him a smile that was all teeth and no warmth. She held out the drive. "Mr. Vance wants the new files loaded for the finale," she said, her voice projecting a calm authority. "He said it was a surprise for the board." The boy hesitated, glancing at the stage where Silas was now gesturing toward Julian. "I didn't hear anything about. Do you want to be the one to tell him you missed the highlight of his career?" Elena asked, her eyes locking onto his. The technician swallowed hard and took the drive. On stage, Silas was reaching the crescendo of his lie. And now, to ensure the future of this great legacy, I am proud to announce that my nephew, Julian, will be taking a permanent seat on the executive board, overseeing the transfer of the Penhaligon holdings into the Vance Trust. Julian stepped forward, looking like a man heading to the gallows. The applause was deafening, a roar of approval from a room full of people who had no idea they were cheering for a thief. Silas turned, his face flushed with the high of his own power. He looked out over the crowd, his eyes searching for Elena, wanting to see her defeated, wanting to witness her realization that he had won everything. He found her standing at the very back of the room, her hand resting on the edge of the light console. Elena raised her chin. She didn't look like a stonemason. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a judge. And now, Silas shouted over the fading applause, let us look at the future we are building together. He gestured grandly to the screens behind him. Elena's finger hovered over the enter key on the console, her gaze fixed on Silas's smug, triumphant face. Wait for it, she whispered to the empty air. The screens flickered to black. The room went silent, the kind of silence that precedes a lightning strike. Silas frowned, turning to look at the dark monitors. He opened his mouth to make a joke to cover the technical glitch, but the first image bloomed onto the 60-foot display before he could speak. It wasn't a blueprint. It wasn't a charity photo. It was a bank statement. Elena watched as the color began to drain from Silas's neck, a slow, creeping pallor that signaled the end of the world he had built. She didn't look away. She wanted to see every second of the collapse. The silence in the grand ballroom was a physical weight, heavier than any slab of granite Elena Vance had ever carved. 500 guests, the cream of the city's elite, sat frozen as the 60-foot screen behind Silas Vance pulsed with the cold, blue light of a forensic audit. The numbers were staggering. Millions siphoned from the Vance Foundation into offshore accounts, each transaction time-stamped and verified with Silas's own digital signature. Silas turned slowly, his neck craning as if it were made of rusted iron. As his eyes locked onto the ledger, the transformation was visceral. The smug, bronze tan he'd maintained for the cameras seemed to evaporate, replaced by a gray, sickly, translucent hue that made him look 20 years older in an instant. His left eye developed a frantic, rhythmic twitch, and his lower lip, usually set in a firm line of judicial authority, began to tremble uncontrollably. He tried to swallow, but his throat had clearly turned to sand. His Adam's apple bobbed uselessly against his silk tie. His shoulders, which had been thrown back in a victory stance moments ago, slumped forward, making his custom-tailored suit look 3 sizes too large for the hollow man inside it. He was a statue of salt caught in a sudden downpour, dissolving before their very eyes. A collective gasp rippled through the front row. Martha Vance stood up, her hand flying to her throat, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and a dawning, terrible clarity. Beside her, Julian Vance went perfectly still, his face a mask of shattered illusions as he stared at the proof of the debts his father had used to chain him. Arthur Penhaligon leaned back in the shadows of the wings, a grim, satisfied smile touching his lips. Then the murmurs started, sharp, jagged whispers that cut through the air like saws. "Is that the Foundation account?" Someone hissed from the third row. "Look at the dates," another voice whispered, loud enough to carry. That was the year the orphanage wing was supposed to be built. Silas finally found his voice, though it was a thin, reedy thing that cracked under the pressure of the room's judgment. "This is a fabrication," he croaked, clutching the podium so hard his knuckles turned the color of bone. "A technical glitch, a malicious attack by someone who wants to destroy this family's name. Security, shut this down." Elena stepped out from the darkness of the control booth. Her boots, still dusted with the faint white powder of the quarry, sounded like thunder on the polished stage. She didn't shout. She didn't need to. The microphone she held caught every syllable of her steady, low-frequency calm, broadcasting it over the speakers until it vibrated in the guests' chests. "The only person who destroyed the Vance name, Silas, is the man who thought he could build a palace on top of a stolen graveyard." She pointed a steady finger at the screen where a final document bloomed. The original, untampered deed to the Vance estate, bearing her own father's name as the primary beneficiary. Those aren't just numbers. Those are the pensions of the men who broke their backs for your grandfather. That's the money you stole from your own wife and son to fuel a legacy that was never yours to claim. Silas lunged toward her, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. He looked less like a judge and more like a cornered animal, his hair disheveled, his eyes bloodshot. "You're nothing," he screamed, the sound echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "A dirt-stained girl playing with things she doesn't understand. I am the law in this city. I made you and I can break you." The room shifted. The guests at the head table, men and women who had laughed at Silas's jokes only minutes ago, physically recoiled from him. They didn't see a leader anymore. They saw a liability. "No," Elena said, her voice dropping an octave, reaching the back of the room where the security detail was already moving forward, followed by two men in dark suits who didn't look like gala staff. "You were a judge, Silas, but today you're just a defendant." She didn't wait for the authorities to reach the stage. She didn't stay to watch him be led away in the silver handcuffs that would soon replace his gold cufflinks. She turned her back on the chaos, the flashing cameras, and the ruined man who was still screaming her name. The scent of expensive lilies in the foyer was suffocating, but as she pushed through the heavy oak doors and into the crisp, biting air of the night, she finally tasted something she hadn't felt in years. The weight was gone. The stone was set. Elena walked toward the iron gates, leaving the crumbling empire behind her without a single backward glance. The biting winter air didn't suit the heat in Elena's veins as she stood by the iron gates of the estate. 10 minutes had passed since she'd left the ballroom, but the echoes of the sirens were already cutting through the silent, snow-dusted driveway. She didn't have to wait long. The heavy oak doors of the Vance manor swung open again, spilling a harsh, artificial light onto the gravel. Silas Vance was no longer the master of the house. He was being ushered down the stone steps by 2 officers, his movements jerky and uncoordinated. Behind him, the gala guests filtered onto the veranda like a slow-moving tide of silk and wool, their hushed whispers creating a low, buzzing hum that filled the night. Elena watched from the shadows of a towering oak, her fingers grazing the rough bark. The smell of wet asphalt and expensive car exhaust hung heavy in the air. As the officers reached the bottom step, Silas stopped, his head snapping toward the iron gates as if he could sense her presence. The skin around Silas Vance's eyes didn't just wrinkle. It seemed to wither, turning a sickly, translucent gray that made him look 20 years older in a heartbeat. His lower lip trembled, a frantic, rhythmic twitch that he couldn't suppress no matter how hard he clenched his jaw. The arrogance that usually sat like a crown on his brow had vanished, replaced by a hollow, wide-eyed terror that darted between the cameras and the cold, indifferent faces of the men holding his arms. His breath came in ragged, wet hitches, the sound of a man drowning in the very air he'd once thought he owned. The silver handcuffs bit into his wrists, contrasting sharply with the gold watch he still wore, a useless relic of a life that had just been dismantled. "This is a mistake," Silas shrieked, his voice cracking and thin. He looked back at the crowd, searching for a friendly face, but the board members were already turning their backs. The chairman of the investment group adjusted his spectacles, his expression one of clinical disgust, before walking back inside without a word. Julian Vance stepped forward then, his face a mask of fractured pride. He looked at his father, then at the flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the manor's windows. He didn't move to help. He simply stood there, his hands deep in his pockets, the weight of his own gambling debts finally settling on his shoulders like lead. "Julian," Silas barked, trying to regain a shred of his old authority. "Call the firm. Tell them the girl has faked the documents. Tell them she's a thief." Julian didn't blink. "She didn't fake the signature, Dad. I saw the original deed. It's been in Penhaligon's vault for 20 years. A cold, sharp satisfaction bloomed in Elena's chest. She stepped out from behind the tree, the gravel crunching softly under her boots. The movement drew every eye. Martha Vance appeared at the top of the stairs, her shoulders square for the first time in a decade. She didn't look at Silas, she looked directly at Elena. With a slow, deliberate motion, Martha pulled the heavy diamond pendant from her neck, the one Silas had bought to mark his first judicial appointment, and dropped it onto the stone floor. The sound of the jewel hitting the granite was as loud as a gunshot in the quiet night. Arthur Penhaligon emerged from the foyer, clutching a leather-bound folder. He walked past the officers and stood beside Elena. He didn't say a word, but he handed her a small, heavy brass key. It was the key to the master study, the heart of the Vance Empire. Silas lunged toward her, but the officers held him fast. "You think you can just take it? You're a stone cutter. You're nothing but dirt and dust." Elena met his gaze, her eyes as hard as the marble she spent her days shaping. She felt the weight of the brass key in her palm, its cold edges grounding her. She thought of her mother, who had died in a rented room while Silas lived in a palace built on stolen inheritances. "You're right about one thing, Silas," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the crisp air, reaching every witness on the veranda. "I know exactly what dirt and dust are. I've spent my life working with them. But you've spent 30 years trying to build a monument to yourself. You just didn't realize you were carving your own headstone." The silence that followed was absolute. Silas opened his mouth to retort, but no sound came out. He looked at the house, then at his wife, then at the son who wouldn't meet his eyes. The realization finally hit him, not just that he was going to jail, but that the name he had obsessed over was now a stain. The officers guided him into the back of the cruiser. The door slammed with a finality that echoed off the manor walls. As the car pulled away, the crowd began to disperse, the spectacle over, the social hierarchy already recalibrating to exclude the man who was once its center. Elena didn't stay to watch the tail lights disappear. She turned toward Arthur, the key still warm in her hand. "Is it done?" "The locks are being changed as we speak," Arthur replied, his voice thick with a quiet, decades-old relief. "The forensic accountants will be here at dawn. There isn't a single cent he can hide now." She looked up at the great stone house, the lights flickering as the staff began to shut down the gala. It was a beautiful structure, but it was hollow. She felt a strange, lingering ache, a realization that justice, while necessary, didn't erase the years of silence. "Where will you go?" Julian asked, stepping toward her as the last of the guests departed. He looked smaller now, the golden child glow extinguished. Elena didn't answer him. She didn't owe him her destination. She walked toward her old, battered truck parked outside the gates, the engine turning over with a familiar, rough growl. She had what she came for, but as she looked in the rearview mirror at the crumbling Vance legacy, she knew the hardest part was yet to come. The empire was gone, but the ghosts were still standing in the hallways. 6 months after the lights had flickered out at the Vance estate for the final time, the world felt smaller, quieter, and infinitely more solid. Elena Vance stood in the center of her new workshop, the air thick with the clean, sharp scent of limestone dust and the mineral tang of wet granite. The high rafters of the converted barn caught the afternoon sun, casting long, golden fingers across the heavy oak workbenches. There was no marble here, no gilded frames, and no suffocating silence of a legacy built on lies. There was only the honest weight of the mallet in her hand. She smoothed her thumb over the rough grain of a half-finished sculpture. The tactile reality of the stone grounded her in a way her inheritance never could. She had spent the morning carving the delicate veins of a leaf into a memorial headstone, her hands steady and caked in white powder. The scars from her years of labor were still there, etched into her knuckles, but they no longer felt like marks of shame. They were the tools of her trade. The sound of gravel crunching under tires broke her concentration. She didn't flinch or reach for a hidden recording device. Those days were over. She set her tools down and wiped her hands on a rag as Arthur Penhaligon stepped through the wide barn doors. He looked different without the shadow of the Vance manor looming over him. The stiff, guarded posture of a family secret keeper had softened into the relaxed gait of a man who finally had permission to grow old. "The commission for the city square is coming along, I see," he said, his voice echoing pleasantly against the stone walls. He stopped a few feet away, admiring the work with a genuine smile. "Grandmother Beatrice would have been proud, Elena, not of the money, but of the craftsmanship." "It's honest work, Arthur," she replied, offering him a stool. "That's all I ever wanted." He sat, resting his hands on his knees. "I thought you should know the final accounts have been settled. The estate sale of the manor was completed yesterday. The building is being converted into a public library and historical center. The Vance name will stay on the stone, but the gates will never be locked again." Elena felt a strange, quiet thrum of satisfaction. The fortress of exclusion had finally been breached by the public it had looked down upon for decades. She picked up a small chisel, turning it over in her hand. "And the others?" Arthur's expression turned solemn, the lines around his eyes deepening. "Silas is where he belongs. The state-funded medical wing isn't a prison in the legal sense, but for him, it's a cage of the worst kind. He spends his days in a room that smells of industrial lemon cleaner and old paper. The nurses told me he still tries to hold court. He sits by the window in a tattered bathrobe, demanding his gavel and trying to pass judgment on the orderlies who bring him his medication. They just call him Mr. Silas and tell him to eat his gelatin. The man who once decided the fates of hundreds can't even choose the channel on the television." Elena looked away, a brief image of the judge in his prime, towering and arrogant, flashing through her mind. The fall hadn't been quick, but it had been absolute. Stripped of his title, his pension, and his dignity, he was a ghost haunting a linoleum hallway. It was a proportional justice. He was finally as powerless as the people he had spent a lifetime crushing. "Julian is still in the city," Arthur continued, his tone shifting to something more hopeful. "He's working as a junior clerk in a mid-sized firm. No more tailored suits or private drivers. He's taking the bus to work and paying off the debts his father left in his name, one paycheck at a time. He sent a letter. He didn't ask for money. He just asked if you'd received the photos Martha sent." "I did," she said, glancing toward her workbench. A postcard sat propped against a jar of graphite pencils. It showed a sun-drenched vineyard in Tuscany. Martha had finally left the valley, traveling with a small group of women she'd met at a community center. In the photo, she was laughing, her hair windblown and her face free of the practiced, frozen mask she had worn for 40 years. She was learning to breathe without checking the temperature of the room or the mood of her husband. "She looks happy," Arthur noted. "She looks free," Elena corrected. But as she looked back at the stone memorial she was carving, Elena felt the lingering ache that justice couldn't quite dull. She had won the war, and she had reclaimed her life, but the cost remained. She had lost the father she thought she had. The man in the linoleum room was a stranger who shared her DNA, a hollow shell of a childhood hero who had never truly existed. The Vance legacy was a graveyard of wasted years, and while she had survived, she carried the weight of the silence she'd endured. She picked up her mallet again, the cold steel a comfort against her palm. She wasn't a Vance heir today. She was a woman building something that would last long after the names were forgotten. "Are you coming to the dedication ceremony next month?" Arthur asked as he stood to leave. Elena looked at the stone, then out at the rolling hills beyond the barn. "No," she said softly. "I've spent enough time standing in front of crowds. I think I'll stay here and work." She watched him drive away, the dust settling back onto the road. The valley was quiet. She turned back to the granite, the mallet striking the chisel with a rhythmic, steady beat. Each strike was a declaration. Each chip of stone was a piece of the past falling away. She was no longer defined by what was taken from her, but by what she was brave enough to create from the ruins. The ghosts were still in the hallways of the old house, but Elena Vance was finally out in the light.
I hope you enjoyed this tale. Please subscribe to support the channel. Goodbye for now.